Hello, welcome to our 12th lesson on the GCSE Families Unit in Sociology. We're going to be looking at the changing rates of divorce. So less about the theory and more about looking at some hard numbers themselves and seeing what we can make of them. So let's get into your do now task. So I want you to see if you can remind yourself of these key terms that we have. So we've got the ruling class ideology, warm bath theory, the double burden, expressive instrumental role, triple shift, and the false class consciousness. I want you to have a look at these first before you go on and see if you can figure out which each of them are, how you would define them. So give the video a pause and then hear the answers. Okay, so here are the answers. So the ruling class ideology is the class that holds the money, holds the power, and the shape of the ideology of society. So society, what does society value comes from the ruling class. So for example, we are told that it is important to have to stay on top of the latest model phone. And this idea comes from the ruling class because they're the ones which have all the technology, and so this is what we, the lower classes, would aspire to have. Warm bath theory is the idea that the family provides emotional support to its members. So the breadwinner comes home, so typically the father will come home and he, from the stressful day, and he's able to come home and remove that stress because his family is a comfort to him. He's able to talk about all the issues which helps de-stress him and relax. And I say him because I'm just being general here. And then they're feeling relaxed. So it's like a warm bath, slipping into a warm bath. The double burden is the workload of people who earn money but also are responsible for the domestic work. So it's double burden because they're doing two forms of work basically. The triple shift is like this. So I'll go around to the triple shift. The triple shift is paid work, housework, as well as emotional work. And this typically comes from the mum. So she is doing both. She's doing all three. So she's dealing with the emotional needs of perhaps the husband, the children, after having worked herself, and then she's also having to do domestic work as well. So be careful not to get too confused. A lot of people think the double burden is domestic work and emotional work. It's not. It's domestic work and paid work. So the expressive and instrumental roles. The expressive role provide care, love, and affection, security, and all the necessary emotional support. And the instrumental role is the breadwinner. And then false class consciousness. This is where members of the proletariat unwittingly misperceive their real position in society. So they think that, oh, I'm more important than they really think they are, or they think that they're a lot further up the social hierarchy than they really are. Moving on. Okay, so what are we doing today? So we want to, how can we explain the changing rates of divorce in the UK? This will be your 12-mark question, or something along your lines that you will need to answer for me, which will be assessed. So when we're talking about divorce, you need to be handle it with a degree of sensitivity. I'm going to go over those homework from last lesson. We're going to be looking at some analysis. There's some statistics analysis. I want you to identify changes in social attitudes. So we've talked a lot more so about how marriage has changed, not so much about divorce. So we're going to look at those, applying those changes in social attitudes. You know, why did marriage change? Why are people getting married less? Well, we're going to do the same thing. Why are people getting divorced more or less? Explaining the link between social change and legal change, and then using the chicken and the egg scenario to explain the social legal changes, particularly with divorce in the UK. So let's do some homework check. So as I mentioned in the previous video, there were some questions which you need to answer. So it is a true or false that I realized. So, divorce is most common in middle-aged couples. True or false? It's false. Uh, all people will get divorced at least once in their life. Well, I'm sure this was rather obvious. It certainly is false. Next one. Divorce becomes more likely for couples whose children have left home. It is true. This is sort of known as the empty nest syndrome. So when and this is what I've got the picture of, when the children leave, the couples who have been so focused on their children now have time to themselves, and because they're so used to putting this time into other things, uh, they sort of struggle to handle this sort of now time that they have with each other, and then all of a sudden these issues start coming up, and when they were previously able to sort of push those issues away or aside because they've got children and other things, they've now got really no more distractions. So that is why this can happen. Working class people don't get divorced. Well, I mean that's very false. Paul Bohannan argued that there are six stations of divorce, which is true. I believe that was talked about in the reading. Bohannan argued that mothers always get custody of their children. That's false. Bohannan argued that after divorce, both people will always move to a new area. That is also false. There are no consequences of divorce on the wider family. Absolutely, there is consequences, so that is false. And then lastly, there are only negative consequences of divorce for children, which is also false. So I think it was like, oh wait, no, there's one more question. Divorced parents can never get along after their divorce. Well, that is also false. So I think there was only two truths out of all of that. Okay, so let's actually look at some numbers here. Divorce. So you can kind of see, and we've got the number that is yellow at the top. That is the number of marriages that have been happening. And then you can see the blue line, which is the number of divorces. And you can kind of see there is a little line there. The Divorce Reform Act 1969 comes into effect, and boy is there a change on those two lines. So describe the rate of divorce between 1956 and 1966. Well, what are we looking at? The rate of divorce. You can see between 1956 and 66 down here, you can kind of see that it is pretty flat. Okay, there isn't a huge change. Okay, so there is a slight, very slight increase, maybe you could say, but it's a bit of a plateau there. So question number 2, identify the trend in divorce from 1969, which is here, to 1990, which is sort of in between here. So trend in divorce, it shoots up quite dramatically and then has a slow increase, and it continues to increase all the way through. Number 3, identify the trend in divorce between 2000, which is about here, to 2016. You can see it is decreasing. It is decreasing. And identify the trend in marriage between 1970 and 2016. So between 1970, which is about here, to 2016, you can see marriage is clearly declining quite consistently too. So marriage is declining and divorce is also declining. Okay, so if we want to explain the changes in the UK divorce rate, so here we go. So the 2015 Office for National Statistics figures estimate that in England and Wales, 42% of marriages will end in divorce overall. Now, you've got to be careful with this number. You've got to be very, very careful with this number. It does not mean that every single person has a 42%, every single person who gets married, there is a 42% chance that it will end in divorce. Okay? Does not mean that. That means 42% of marriages overall will end in divorce. Now, this includes people who are on their second, third, fourth, fifth marriages. Okay? And I want you to understand that your chance of divorce increases dramatically after you've already had your first marriage. So if you're divorced once, your likelihood of divorcing again is even higher. So if we remove all those people, if we say first time, if we look at the number for first time divorces, so people who are divorcing for the first time, the number is significantly lower. So you've got to be careful. Does not mean that you've got a 40% chance of your marriage failing. That is not true. So you got to be careful looking at those numbers. So 34% of marriages will end divorce by their 20th anniversary. Again, you got to be careful on how these numbers are figured out. 60% of marriages will survive the 20th wedding anniversary, but some will still end in divorce after the 20th anniversary. Could you imagine being married to someone for 20 years and then you divorce them later on? It's tragic. 16% of marriages will reach their 60th anniversary. 60 years being married. Well, you got to bear in mind the age of those people would be quite old. So if you got married when you're 25, you would be 85 years old, and that's quite an achievement in itself. Okay, if you got married when you were 30, you would be 90. So you could probably say one of the reasons why a lot of people don't reach their 60th anniversary probably is to do with the fact that people die out around that time, and the average length of marriage is 32 years. 32 years. So here we go. Some raw data here. So the number of divorces. If we look at the jump between 1960 and 1980, goes from 23 to 148, which I think is a change in 125,000. So huge increase, going from 23 to then all of a sudden we have an extra 125,000 divorces. Then over the next 20 years, the number goes down by about 6,200-ish. And then, something like that. And then we go down again to 2014 to 14 years later, and that number has decreased further by about 30,000. So we can see that there is quite a bit of a difference happening here. Less people getting divorced than they were 40 years ago, which is really interesting. Okay, I wonder why that is. Where is my mouse? There it is there. Okay, so let's explain how some of the reasons for declining rates in marriage and the rise in cohabitation and increases in family diversity can also explain changing rates of divorce. Now, this will require you to go back to pages 24 and 48 to help you to do this. So remember, we looked at why is marriage declining, why is cohabitation rising, and why is family diversity changing? How can the reasons for those three things also explain the changing rates in divorce? So I remember we talked about secularization being one of those. Now, you have a section in your book that you need to answer all of these. So I'm going to talk about each one briefly, but you need to go in and you need to fill out a bit more. You need to flick back so you can fill in those boxes. So secularization means that religion is not as important. And if we know anything about marriage, is that marriage is held quite closely with religion. Okay, so particularly Christianity and Islam aren't too big fans of, they're not big fans of people living together who are unmarried. So I would much prefer people to get married. So this is what happens. People get married and they settle down. To them, it is an extremely important thing. Outside of the church, it does not hold that sort of holy side to it. People still find it important. Okay, there is plenty of non-religious reasons to find marriage important, but for the most part, it seems to be like a ceremony and that's it. And even that, people are like, well, what's the point? You're just living together. So people who are secular aren't real fans of marriage. So why would this affect divorce? It's the same thing. Because marriage is not seen as holy, it's not that bad if that breaks. It's not a big of a deal if people aren't, if you get divorced. Whereas to a lot of religious people, it's a big deal if you get divorced. It's seen as sinful by Roman Catholics. You shouldn't be getting divorced. There's no real reason for you. There is some rules, but they will call that's when you get what's known as an annulment. Okay, so 1969 Divorce Reform Act, big changes, and we're going to talk about this later. So I'm gonna skip to the next one because we're going to be talking about this a bit today in detail. A longer life expectancy. Why would that affect divorce rates? So if I'm trying to think, why would this be affecting the divorce rates in terms of it going down? Well, you could say that people are getting married later because of the divorce rates, and because people are getting married later, they're not rushing into marriages as quickly as they are, and so they're a lot more confident, and as a result, those marriages are lasting. How would it affect the divorce rate? People are also quite happy to get married a lot later as well. So they're quite happy to divorce and then remarry again. Not too sure about how I would go about answering that one. I'll be very interested to hear what you think. Changing gender roles. Oh, here we go. So this is a nice easy one. So you've got women who are quite keen to work more, and so they're more career orientated. And so if there's a relationship that might impact that, then it's a lot easier for them to seek a divorce. So that way they are able to chase their careers. That's just one example. 2019 Divorce Reform Act, we will talk about that, but this is the idea of no-fault divorce, so that you don't really need to have a reason for a divorce. So, and here we go, additional information on changes. So, but actually, before we look at those changes, let's look at some key terms. So, we've got adultery. So, I feel like I'm going a little bit too quick. So, I feel like I just need to slow down a little bit. So, what we're going to do is going to look at some extra things that might help to explain. So we've already talked about, like, when we're talking about these things here, you need to make sure that you have filled out all those boxes. And if and as we go over, I know I skipped over the 2019 Divorce Act a little bit and the 1969 one. We're going to go back to that. Okay, so when we go back to that, you need to answer that. Okay, so let's look at some of these additional changes, but I want to look at the key terms first. So, adultery means cheating on a partner. File for divorce means that you go in, you pay a lawyer to kickstart the process of getting divorced. A divorce petition is a legal document that explains the reasons for divorce. An irretrievable breakdown is when a relationship is over and it just can't be recovered. So, for reasons, well, it could be anything. It could be money, it could be career choice, it could be living locations, it could be all sorts of different reasons as to why a relationship is not working. This is the point where they've gone to therapy, it is still not working, and it just cannot be recovered. That's an irretrievable breakdown. Legal aid is state money that is provided to pay for legal costs. Legal aid is also where you can get legal advice that is provided by the government. It is generally regarded as you'd be better off getting yourself a proper lawyer. And when I say proper lawyer, that doesn't mean the people who work for legal aid aren't. It typically means that how do I try and put this nicely? I wouldn't go to legal aid as being my first choice if you have the money, because let's just say the quality is better from a private lawyer than it is from a government one. So that's. I think I'm going to stop talking there because I just don't want to sound too mean. Decree nisi, I think it is a temporary state of being divorced. And then decree absolute is the final legal status of being divorced. And uncontested divorce is when a partner or a person who filed for divorce accepts it and they don't try to fight against the divorce process. Most divorces are like this. It gets to the point where they're like, yeah, okay, fine. It's not about fighting to save the marriage. They just realize there's no point going through this. If one person is determined to have a divorce, there's no point trying to really fight that too much because, well, you're not going to change their mind. Really, if one person's mind is made up and you've already been trying. I mean, if somebody, let's say I'm married and let's say my wife just comes in and says, hey, I'm wanting a divorce, I wouldn't take that lying down. I would be, oh, have we tried this, try this, try this, try this, and then eventually, hopefully convince her to do it. But if she wants to go ahead with that divorce, there's nothing I can really do about it, and there's no point stalling the process. Okay, so let's look at what's happened. So over the years, it's been a little bit different. So you can even see in this picture, and I couldn't believe this actually. When I was just Googling for pictures of sort of divorce prior to, like, in the 19th century, and I found this picture very interesting. Husbands apparently, and again, I found this on the History Channel, and you don't know if this is, I mean, the History Channel is can be quite dodgy at times, but they say that apparently English men could sell their wives. So that's why you see a little for sale picture there. So I find that completely outrageous. How humiliating and appalling, but apparently this is how society used to be, which is rather appalling to tell you the truth. Okay, so before 1857, divorce was only available through a private act of Parliament, meaning that the average contract could only be ended through an individual change in the law for the specific couple. You had to take it to Parliament in order to get divorced. So the only acceptable cause for divorce at this time was adultery. This was a very expensive procedure, and therefore only really possible with very wealthy people. Between the 1700 and 1857, there was only 314 divorces of this kind that took place. So over a period of 157 years, these were mostly initiated by the husband. Wives were allowed to file for divorce if they could prove adultery and life-threatening cruelty. That's before 1857. 1857, Matrimonial Causes Act comes in. So adultery remained the sole ground for divorce, although wives could allege cruelty and desertion in addition to the husband's adultery in order to obtain a divorce. So you need to have a pretty good reason. You can't just do it on a whim. You can't do it because he said something not nice, or she's not, I don't know, she's cooked you a bad meal or whatever. Again, I'm trying to talk from the time, not being sexist. So given that, in order to get a divorce, you still had to have some form of proof. So 100 years go by, and we get to the 1950 Divorce Act, which is the ground for divorce remains the same, which is adultery, cheating on your partner. However, petitioners could apply for legal aid to help with divorce costs. So again, divorce is still an expensive process. It does involve courts, so you need to have some sort of legal aid to help you get through that. This brings us to the 1969 Divorce Act. Here we go. So this is where things change, and this is where you will need to refer back to that task I gave you as to why on earth would the 1969 Divorce Act have an impact on divorce. Well, the law is now recognize irretrievable breakdown. So if there is a point in the relationship where it just cannot be recovered, it is an acceptable reason to file for divorce. Although you need to have a lot of evidence. Okay, so you need to show the evidence. So required the same act of evidence as divorce previously from the act removed. The concept of matrimonial offences from divorce law. This meant that divorce was no longer considered as being the fault of one partner. A couple could divorce once proof of irretrievable breakdown was established. And these are what some proof could be. So mutually agreed separation, so you've lived apart for a minimum of 2 years. Unreasonable behavior, so there's drunkenness, not paying the share of the bills, as abuse, adultery, separation of 5 years of longer without mutual consent. And I also think it was also if the couple haven't had, if they haven't slept together. I think that's also another one. I know in Canada, I believe that's the case. And Canada is also it's a constitutional monarchy like the UK. So I think it could be similar. Not too sure, but I'm pretty sure it's something like that as well. Okay, so that's the Divorce Act. It was just a lot easier to get divorced now. So much easier. Still required proof. That is until 1984. So 1984 reduced the minimum length of time that a couple would have to wait to file for a divorce from 3 years to 1 year. Sorry, it wasn't that one that changed it. Maybe it was the 1996 one. This act further relaxed. Yeah, it is. A couple no longer had to prove irretrievable breakdown. They could now simply agree that their marriage had broken down. So, you know, if the couple both agrees that the marriage is irretrievable, a period of reflection was introduced, though, before the divorce could go through. So remember when I talked about this a while back, about why getting married at all. We remember that the whole point of it was to exercise delayed gratification, the gratification being ending the relationship. So people who were impulsive, as we know from the video where they talked about children who took part in the marshmallow test, they were given a marshmallow and told not to eat it, and if they didn't eat it, they would be given another one later. And those children who just could not hold off the marshmallow holding off eating the marshmallow, they were found to be more impulsive later in life. So the whole point of divorce, the whole point of marriage, is to bind a couple in a way that it is difficult to break up. And because you got that difficulty there, it stops them from breaking up on a whim. And because we started to make it easier to get divorced, really a lot of people, perhaps the government deemed to be jumping the gun too quickly. The other thing is it also is hopefully trying to prevent a lot of the legal costs that jump in as well. I might talk about how mediation plays a role in that, depending on where we go with this. Okay, so yeah, that's it. This is the 1996 Divorce Family Law Act. Are we going to talk about the 2019 one? We might talk about that in a bit. So the simplified stages, and here are the stages for Britain. So one or both partners files a petition for divorce, pays the $550 in fees. A judge considers with the petition to judge whether grounds for divorce are in place. If the judge is satisfied for a divorce, a decree of nisi is issued. And remember, that is temporary divorce. And then if they agree the terms of divorce, so the couple will argue about what's going on, what's going to happen to the children, what's going to happen with this, blah, blah, blah. Goes through, judge agrees, yep, that's good, you've got that sorted, excellent, tick. We'll then finalize the divorce. So, yeah, so hopefully, you've now got a bit of an idea of where we have come from. You can kind of see we've gone from a point of, sort of like where it was very difficult to a point of where it's a lot easier to do so. I'm just trying to see if I can find, if we do talk about the 19, we do talk about the 2019 Divorce Reform Act. So I've skipped ahead. I'm going to have to just go back. But this is what really happened. So the 2019, which is very recent, last year, introduces a new reason for couples, or one person in the marriage, to file for a no-fault divorce. Okay, so this is actually going to require you to do a bit of Googling. I want you to explain how the new no-default reason for divorce is different from what people who wanted to get divorced had to prove, and identify and explain the reasons people in the video give. Oh, there's a video? Oh yeah, there's a link. I will pull that up actually later. And then what was the next little thing? You identify why the Coalition of Marriage argues that no-fault divorce are negative addition. So there's a lot of people argue that it is not necessarily a good thing. Okay, let's go back to where we were. So we looked through the process of how it works. Now, how do we explain the social change and the legal change that's going on? So explain the relationship between social change and legal change. So the 1960s was a decade of enormous social change. So we remember that there was that Divorce Act that happened in 1969, and we see that huge spike in divorces. So the end of World War II gave a rise to new ideas and optimism and personal freedom. That's what I'm showing you in this picture here. So there were spectacular youth subcultures were common. Full employment meant more disposable income. The younger generations were fighting what they saw as a social revolution for change against the values of the older generation. This is known as the swinging 60s, by the way. So I'm going to show you a video, and I want you to explain how these points led to change. So we've got sexual freedom, you've got swinging London, we've got pressure for social change and freedom, and we've got technological change, and then lastly we've got a rise in consumerism. We're going to go over these points, but you need to, as you're watching this video, start to fill in those little spots there. You actually have the spots to fill out in your booklet. So let's watch the video. I think it's like 2 or 3 minutes long. So let's have a watch. It is embedded. So if you're watching from the through the PowerPoint, it is here. So let's have a watch.
Iconic sights and sounds of the 1960s, all explored at a new exhibition at London's Victoria and Albert Museum. You Say You Want a Revolution takes a close look at the years 1966 to 1970, when young people turned the Western world upside down. London was the swinging 60s capital.
The whole atmosphere was different. There was a form of sexual freedom enjoyed not only by men, but by girls as well. Everything went, you know, you could almost do anything. You know, there was much more freedom in a sense than there is today.
As London swung, young people in other countries had a more serious agenda. In Paris, students rioted to show support for striking workers. In the United States, students and young people protested for civil rights and against the Vietnam War. Pressure for social change and greater freedom took many forms.
It was still perfectly legal in this period to pay women a different amount, less, that is, for doing exactly the same job as a man. I mean, that was now incredible. You could only get the pill if you were a married woman at the beginning of our period. Abortion was illegal, theatre was still censored.
Technological changes also helped fuel the revolution in space exploration and consumer spending. The 5 years were definitely revolutionary, with young people driving the agenda in music, fashion, politics, and this show brings it all together. Organizers hope people who see the show will be inspired by the 50-year-old message of peace and joy, and leave with a desire to bring more unity to the present world. Jessica Baldwin, Al Jazeera, London.
Fantastic. Right. So let's look at what it was that I did ask you to do. So how could the following examples of social change from the video influence the change in divorce law? Okay. Woo, very slow. So, it's jargon. So, sexual freedom for women and for men. So, again, this is more something I would rather you do. How did that, from the video, what was being said, how would this affect divorce? Well, again, I think this idea of people being able to, I mean, sex was something that was seen that could only really happen between married couples, and this sort of then started to change. People were more open to engaging in sexual relationships outside of marriage, and because people are doing that, people are therefore getting married less, which then mean people are getting divorced less. So when you've got less people who are married, then obviously divorce number will go down. Swinging in London, again, these youth subcultures that are coming out, these sort of protesting things. So again, the sexual sort of freedom that comes out of that sort of really sparked second wave feminism and third wave, more so actually more third wave feminism, this idea that women were able to be not put down because of them divorcing or for them engaging in sexual relationships. There's lots of reasons you can talk about swinging in London, but you can see there was a big underchange. Pressure for social change and freedom, again, huge pressure for women to have more equality in the marriage, and because divorce was more than women, they were initiated by men. This put the power in the hands in both partners, meaning that women now had the ability to divorce just as easily as a man could. Technological change. You can, I guess, that would also affect relationships itself. You could talk a bit about particularly women in the workforce, how it meant that new technology made it accessible for women to access jobs. There was a lot more freedom in the home, which meant that women were able to, like, looking after the house isn't necessarily a full-time job if you've got good technology. So I'm referring to things like vacuum cleaners, washing machines, all these things. It's quite easy to actually maintain a house. Given that women who were typically the carers of the house now actually have the opportunity to get that done quickly so they can go to work. Again, talking from a historical point here where women were the primary caretakers, rise in consumerism. Okay, this also is fueling those subcultures as well. Disposable income, people staying out more, people buying products and things as well. How would this affect marriage and relationships? Again, I want you to write the answer instead of me just giving you the answers. Okay. If you need to go and rewatch that, feel free to do so. Okay, so let's keep pushing with this. So as we've seen, changes in attitudes of people in society can and does lead to changes in the law. So there were numerous changes in social attitudes. So young people felt a strong sense of their own liberty, personal freedom. It was part of their life, and it was not right for them, and they would change it. So as in this pressure to get married is a good one, actually. So this is very different from the attitudes of the previous generations. So even if we look at the previous generation, and I'm going to include myself in your group because I'm also not married, so I'm like you guys, not married, whereas the group before us got married at a much, much younger age. So my parents got married in their early 20s. Your parents probably might be the same. And if we go back even further, they got married even younger and younger and younger. What was I watching? I was watching something the other day on Netflix. Oh, it was The Tiger King. That there were two people in it, and they got married when I think the guy was 16 and the girl was 14, had parental permission to do so. That is unheard of today. The idea of a 14-year-old and 16, or the idea of just 16-year-old getting married is, could you imagine? You know, you guys are 15, so could you imagine getting married next year? Ooh. So, yeah, you can see how already that there's changes in ages. So, you know, it does change, and this still happens today. So, back in the 60s in particular, though, this is when the rebellion sort of really started. So it's very different from the attitudes of the previous generations who believed that one needed to accept their situation without fuss, and whether it was be an unhappy marriage or anything else. So if you're in an unhappy marriage, too bad, suck it up, deal with it. These social changes led to changes in law then. So the changes in the law also have effect on people's social attitudes. Not everyone was part of the swinging 60s. Okay, or they weren't part of a spectacular youth subculture. However, once the law and divorce changed, this had an enormous effect on the view of marriage and divorce on the whole of British society. It was like the government agreeing that marriage and divorce were now more disposable arrangements and they were no longer sacred. Then there's less social stigma connected to divorce. So this kind of brings us with a bit of and this is why I said a chicken or egg problem. So, chicken or the egg. So we can use the chicken or egg scenario because when we're looking at social change leading to legal change, which could explain the change in divorce laws. So how could the social legal change situation be related to the chicken or the egg scenario? And think that it's sort of implying that, well, when there's social change, it creates legal change. But then when that legal change, it sort of creates social change. So which one is it? So I think there is an answer though to this, because not all of society maybe a loud part of society wanted the change, which then brought about legal change, which then brought about overall societal acceptance. So I don't agree necessarily with this analogy. It's not the same. It's certainly not the same. But I can kind of see where they're going with this. But ultimately, it all starts with the social change from the subgroups. So I've already talked about this. There is a video, but I think just for the sake of time, if you want, it is embedded in the PowerPoint notes section. I'll also link it in the description as well. If you want to have a look at that, that's fine. And if you want to read a lot more about no-fault divorce, go for it. But I just think in light of where I'm wanting you to go with this, we might leave it. We might leave it for the time being. Okay, so, so 12-mark question. Here we go. So there is a 12-mark question, and this is something which you need to do. You have to do this, and you have to send it in to me. Okay, so you need to discuss how far sociologists would agree that the changes in the rate of divorce are mainly the result of social change. So we talked about social change being the underlying ideas of the social groups. So how much of it is coming from social groups, and and changes in society? Is it all more legal, or is it more more social? So there are some tips here. You need to briefly explain how divorce rate has changed in the UK. So I want you to do this in the introduction. Refer back to some trends. But it's quite obvious to say, look, this is what's happened, and this is where it's going now. Then you want to launch into your main body, which is where you weigh up whether social changes. So is this the impact of feminism, secularization, liberal attitudes, or is it legal changes? So is it the Divorce Act, the 2019 Divorce Act, and no-fault divorces? So I would recommend that you do go and look at that article in video. Are the most important reason for explaining changes in the divorce rates. You can consider other changes, so technological changes as well, medical advancements, etc., contraception, abortion, if you want to do that as well. The conclusion needs to make an overall judgment about which argument is the most convincing. So this is, this can be it's 100% social change or legal change, or it can be a combination. Don't write, in my opinion, arguably. I want you to come to a definitive conclusion on this. So you're not arguing your opinion. You're saying this is what it is. This is why. This is how I know. This is why I know. With that, this is going towards your grade. So King Pago wants you to. He's decreeing that you need to hand it in. So please make sure you do it. It should take you probably about 20 minutes, really. It's a 12-mark question, and it's not. I've seen you guys do a 12-mark question before, so it shouldn't be too hard. I will need this in by, let's see, it's Friday. If I could get this in by Monday, Monday, maybe Tuesday at the absolute latest. Okay, I'll put a post and show my homework, and it will be. There will be a link there for you to submit. Otherwise, you can just email it to me. Thank you to those of you who have already emailed your other assessment in. But for the time being, this should not take you very long. Okay, maybe half an hour, but it's a 12-mark question, which is really it's meant to be a page long, maybe a page and a half. Shouldn't be 2 pages. 2 pages is far too long. Okay, so that's where we're going to leave it. Thank you very much. I'll see you in the next video.